Hello, and welcome to the Pop-Off PCMag video game show. I'm Jordan Miner. Today we're talking about a very special game, Pokémon Legends Arceus. And joining us, we have very special guests, Rebekah Valentine, who reviewed the game for IGN.
Hi, Jordan. Thank you so much for having me. I love talking about Pokemon.
Thanks for joining us. And Will Greenwald, we all know you. You reviewed the game for PCMag. You're special, but we've seen you.
On my way.
Cool. So we're talking about Pokémon Legends Arceus, this hot new reinvention of what Pokemon is. Just came out on the Nintendo Switch. We've all played it. Some of us have written at length about it. Kind of the first question I wanted to kind of pose here is that when we first saw this game about a year ago, already it just promised this entirely reinvented idea of what a Pokemon game even would be. So what were kind of your expectations going into this game as to what they might kind of pull off here? Reb, let's start with you.
Honestly, this is going to sound so mean. I promise I love Pokemon so much, but my expectations were kind of low. I think after, what are we at now? 24-ish years of
25.
Pokemon.
They 25? Just had their whole anniversary celebration.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. After 25 years of Pokemon basically being the same thing. Sure, they've iterated year after year after year, but it really has clung to this very, very samey thing. And when they moved from the 3DS to the Switch, I think they struggled to figure out what it meant to suddenly be on a console instead of a handheld where different types of games reign. And I don't feel they did that very strongly with Sword and Shield. So my expectations were very, very low. I expected it to maybe have some slight shakeups, but to basically be the same game, just looking and feeling marginally different. And I was blown away, honestly, by the fact that it was not that.
Cool. Will, what about you?
I was sort of looking at the promotional stuff they had for it very early on and comparing it against the reactions that a lot of people had of sort of trying to glean what they could from the bits of gameplay footage. So it's like, oh, it's going to be a big open world thing, and it'll be like just this new Pokemon experience. And just part of me thinking in the back of, this isn't a main series Pokemon game. It's probably not going to be like that kind of open world scope, because I'm trying to think if there are any games besides maybe the Xenoblade games and Breath of the Wild that are actually Japanese developed open world games as we think of them.
Metal Gear Solid 5.
Yeah, actually.
Yeah. I think I shared a lot with Breath of the Wild, actually. Those two in my brain are the same game a lot of the times.
Kind of Monster Hunter. I mean, I think Monster Hunter is doing the same thing Arceus does, but it's semi-open world.
Yeah, but they're very zone-based, and that's why I actually compare it with Monster Hunter, because it's not just a huge open world. It's you're going into these big zones. And I wasn't expecting that specifically, but I was also thinking they're not going to make the open world game everyone has been wanting, because there has been this idea of a perfect Pokemon game people have been wanting for 15 years plus.
Oh my God.
And they're never going to make that, and I'd like to be proven wrong.
No, they won't.
Yeah. I don't remember the wild areas of Sword and Shield. it's basically that same thing of, hey, you can run around in this little playground.
But considering how iterative they are, looking at what they did, I saw this, I was like, this is them kind of building those ideas. And I didn't think that they would get all the way there, but I thought that they would get maybe 60% of the way there. That's kind of where I was at, and also just hopefully that it would run better in the final release. And actually, I think they ended up being a little closer than I expected. So we've all played it. You two, we reviewed it. You both gave it the same score, actually, 7 out of 10 and 3.5 out of 5.
Dissenting opinions.
Yeah, I think ours are some of the lowest ones on Metacritic.
They are.
And Critic. It's really weird because I think we both liked the game.
We did. I don't know what PCMag's explicit scale is, but 7 on IGN is good. It means it's a good game.
That's a good score in any context.
Yeah, and it also means kind of what it says if you read into our score explanations too, is that fans of Pokemon will love this, which I think is absolutely true. It's just maybe not. It's maybe not the best game of all time. So
let's get into what we think works about the game. But what do we like about the game? What did they achieve? Where are they successful at?
Would you like to go first?
Go ahead.
Mechanically, just the entire new ideas behind catching Pokemon, building heavily, building so much on top of the kind of tossing your Pokeball thing from Let's Go Pikachu, but just way more of having it actually be kind of Monster Hunter-y, of needing to sort of sneak up and dodge attacks and actually be involved with what you're doing with Pokemon, not just sending out your little pet animals to fight. but still keeping that there. And a small thing that I also just really like that I'd love to see in the main game is the mastery of moves. Like changing it so it's not just back and forth turns, but having it be like agile and strong moves and like almost Final Fantasy X style, figuring out when you're going to go and strategizing around that. That adds a lot of depth to the game.
It's interesting point, because Will, I think you were a little disappointed that they were still sticking with turn-based when that was more obvious.
I wasn't expecting like live action active time battle Pokemon, and it actually was less turn-based than I was expecting. But like so many of the concepts in the game, there are things that Nintendo can and hopefully will build way more on, like that they can develop more.
Cool. What about you, Reb? What do you think works about Arceus?
I actually wasn't quite as high on the agile strong system. I thought it was a really good idea. I felt like I didn't need to use it as much as I possibly could have. But otherwise, I very much agree with what you said. I think alongside that, definitely the breaking down of what all of the concepts that we have always known, the 8 gyms, the Elite Four, Evil Team, a lot of the basic battle mechanics, like changing sleep to drowsy, I think is what it is, changing how moves work, getting rid of a bunch of moves, scrapping things like mega evolutions and breeding and abilities and hold items, all of that. If you had asked me 2 years ago, should they get rid of all that? I would have been like, God, no, like we need all of these things. They're all very fun and cool, but they so well proved that they can get rid of all this. All this was just extra fluff. And at its core, Pokemon battling and catching is actually a very fun activity, especially when you focus on the thing that explicitly makes it fun, which is the Pokemon themselves. So they added a lot of really cool touches, like the Pokemon will behave in like very interesting ways out in the world. I think one of my favorites that I don't think is too spoilery because it's in like the second area, Sudowoodo is in this game, who, if you know anything about the lore of Sudowoodo, it's this rock type Pokemon that looks like a tree and it pretends to be a tree and like blocks the way back in Gold and Silver. And so if you run into Sudowoodo out in the world, it's just kind of, walking along, waving its little arms, looking real cute. But if you see it and it sees you, it will freeze and pretend to be a tree. And it's really easy to catch because it just stays frozen like that because it thinks that it can fool you. And there's a lot of little behaviors like that and little interactions that I think are just so smart and clever. And I think even in like the wild area and Sword and Shield and, like Let's Go, we didn't have that. I mean, we had like an animation for them walking and standing still, but it wasn't ever nearly that detailed. And so I think it makes Pokemon feel alive in a way that they were not previously, and just breaking everything, all the extra trappings surrounding Pokemon down and just focusing on that very, very core thing and making that really good, I think works mostly well.
Yeah, there's way more of a feeling that these are actual creatures and not just like recruitable demons like in SMT games of just like you run into a guy, you pay him some money, he joins your team. No, in Arceus, you finally feel like these are animals wandering around that you can just capture in balls.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say it sells the fantasy, right? Because when Pokemon first came out, I was a little kid. Like I was young enough to be outside, like throwing little squishy balls, pretending they were Pokeballs, like playing pretend with Pokemon and imagining in my head, oh, we just went around the corner of the house and caught a Pikachu. Like that was the age that I was at and the imagination thing that I was having in my head, even though my only real conception of Pikachu was like the little sprite that was on the screen that was static. Right. And this is what I was imagining in my head back then as a kid. This is as close as we've ever gotten.
I was gonna say that, yeah, everything that surrounds like you being in a physical space in this game, I think works great. Like all the kind of pseudo stealth game stuff when you're like sneaking up on them and have to like be aware of the physical properties of the Pokeball of like this one will fly farther, this one will be better if you hit him from behind and stuff like that. Or even just like the fact that when you like initiate a battle, it like happens in front of you and you can walk around it and like see it's not in this abstract battle space. It's like a thing that's happening. Yeah. So all that stuff I thought was fantastic.
That's great.
But like we said up front, the game is not perfect. When you do something really ambitious, it tends to be pretty sloppy. So what do we think doesn't work about this game? What did they not pull off? Reb, we'll start with you.
I was saying just now how I think the core, like they got rid of all the extra trappings and the core concept is like very, very strong. And that is what I love about it. But I think in getting rid of all those extra trappings, they needed to fill that with something. The world, I mean, we can talk, I think the world is like ugly. just sort of baseline, but I think I would have gotten over the fact that the world was ugly were it not also just very noticeably empty at all times. I mean, I recognize this is a game that happens before the history of Diamond and Pearl. So no, it's not going to be populated with like giant bustling cities. I wasn't expecting that, but there are just so many moments. There are so many locations on the map named after areas in Diamond and Pearl. There's one like very early on, that's like the Floro Gardens or I think in Obsidian Fieldlands, there's like a Floro area, which you think about like Floroma Town or whatever. And so I went there and I think I was expecting, I don't know, something. I don't know what I was expecting, but all it is just some trees, some Beautifly and Combi that I've seen before, and some flowers on the ground. And there is like an encounter you can have there later, which I guess is a little more special, but there's a lot of things like that. There's a better example, I guess, is there's a cave that you can run into in that same area that you have to like throw a Pokemon at it to smash the rock and break it. And I got really excited. I thought, oh, I found a secret. This is so cool. And I went inside and there were like 3 Zubats in there. And it was just a single straight line. And then on the other side, it was an area I had already been to. It was so disappointing. And there were so many moments like that where I thought I would come on like a ruin or maybe even a dungeon. Like I kept waiting for there to be a dungeon, like some equivalent to what the gyms had been. And there was just literally nothing. And I don't think it necessarily needed to repeat the things that Pokemon had been doing for years and years and years. But I think the Pokemon feel very alive. The world that they live in does not.
Yeah, that was kind of my biggest complaint too. Of the zones are sort of geographically very big, but they're not nearly as dense as even Breath of the Wild, which doesn't have like a lot of settlements per se, but there are things to do there. Like there are a bunch of little things you can uncover. There are shrines. There are places to go into that have a feeling that there are activities there, and there just isn't much of that in any of the zones in Arceus. Like there are maybe like a tiny handful of like caves to explore, like 2 or 3 in each zone. And like maybe, and maybe like 2 camps or like really tiny villages that you can't do anything with until you have a side quest to do something that
you can't even heal there. What's up with that? Yeah.
It's just like, and even just visually, there aren't a ton of interesting landmarks to go by. So there just isn't so even though these are geographically big areas, they feel small just because like you're wandering around the same looking places all over. And like the only navigation you have is bodies of water and which Pokemon are there. And that's, it's disappointing. It still feels way better than the wild areas in Sword and Shield, because there's more content there, but it isn't much.
Yeah.
My issue still remains like these games make so much money. And like, I know trying to parse out exactly how Nintendo relates to the Pokemon company gets a little confusing because it's not like they don't own them directly, but like these games make so much money. They're like really major games. It's so wild to me that they can't seem to like give them more money or more time or something. They always just end up feeling kind of rushed. I'm willing to maybe accept the argument that just getting all these Pokemon to work at all is kind of takes up more technical bandwidth than we realize. The very diverse body types, including Gengar's in the game. I'll see that my shirt shows up. But yeah, it's just weird that these games aren't like, I don't know, like this is like the kind of like the format of like a AAA game, but it feels like it's still lacking like the budget and polish.
Yeah. And like, I don't want to aggressively compare this to Breath of the Wild, because Breath of the Wild is my favorite game of all time. It is, I think, to many, one of the best games of all time. I mean, I won't like make objective proclamations on that. But I think a lot of people feel like that's the thing. They clearly played Breath of the Wild. If you listen to like the sound effects and like look at the way the UI is laid out, this is a game that these people looked at Breath of the Wild, played Breath of the Wild, and said, "This is working. We're going to do this." But then they didn't take one of the biggest and best lessons from Breath of the Wild, which is that moment that you have when you go up a hill in Breath of the Wild and you look around and you immediately see like 10 different things that you want to run towards and do. And you start running towards one of them, and on your way, you get distracted by like 20 other things. And maybe that's a little excessive for what Pokemon is trying to be, because you do want catching and battling Pokemon to be at the center of it. But they needed something. They needed some equivalent to what shrines are in Breath of the Wild, or what like the little like Bokoblin camps are, like things like meaningful landmarks, meaningful places, a memorable world, a world that actually feels like it is the Hisui to Sinnoh, like the ancient version of the place that is already very familiar and comfortable to you.
It also doesn't help that the Switch is like 5 years old now, and the draw distance has gotten way worse than Breath of the Wild.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
They're just, you can't actually see stuff far away if you want to go to it because it needs to pop in. But I think a big thing with comparing it to Breath of the Wild and like all of Nintendo's first party stuff, and even like saying they want to do a AAA game, this would definitely be its own long discussion. But I think philosophically, Nintendo doesn't have the concept of AAA. Like the closest thing is Breath of the Wild, but even for their big tentpole just series, they don't really pour money into it to make it the most amazing thing ever. Like Breath of the Wild is the closest thing they've done it to, but Mario, new Zelda stuff, Pokemon, they just kind of build on concepts and see what they can play with, but they are very far from like every other developer and publisher's idea of just pay as much as you want to make this look as shiny and technically amazing as possible. Nintendo just never does that.
I agree with you in terms of scale, except for Zelda, but I do think Nintendo cares about polish in a way that these Pokemon games don't necessarily do. That I kind of find it a little frustrating. But I agree with you in terms of, like, yeah, they're not blowing out in terms of like, right. Yeah, in terms of scale, I agree. I will say, like, yeah, like the only aspect of this game that sort of gives me that Breath of the Wild feeling of just sort of like endless distraction is just like the different options they give you for all the research. Like I just kind of go and like, oh, if I catch a bunch or I defeat a bunch with a certain move or catch one at night or whatever, like that's all kind of filling out the Pokedex. And that can kind of feel like a grind, but I do appreciate that they have different avenues for kind of completing that stuff. And it lends this feeling of like anything I'm doing, if I'm just kind of like, you know, messing around in this overworld doing Pokemon stuff, like it is contributing to a larger goal.
It reminds me of Pokemon Snap, which is its own thing.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah,
I want to actually jump on that point that you made though, Jordan, about it feeling like a grind. So we actually held our review until launch day because the timeline we were given was very, very short. And I felt much more confident in that decision when I got to where, and I'm not going to spoil this for people who are listening, but when you get to the point where the credits roll, the main story continues after that. And I now know what the culmination of that is. But when you're in the moment and you're just playing through, it very much feels like the story is not over at that point. Like there is still more to do. And so I did not feel that I had fully beaten the game at that point, and I wanted to for the review. So I kept going. I put in a total of 64 hours before I filed my review. And at that point, I actually had finished the main story quest. But it was a grind to do that. It was there's two different grinds. There's one which is the Pokedex grind, which I do love the many options that it gives you, and I think that's fun when you're doing it just for the sake of it. But when you're sitting there just trying to complete this one specific entry, and you're like, I do not know where this Pokemon is, or I do know where it is, and it's just not spawning because it's a rare spawn, and so I have to keep refreshing this area over and over. That isn't fun. That isn't what I think of Pokemon. That's not how I think about the discovery of Pokemon, right? Like just going to a spot, seeing the Pokemon's not there, leaving, and then coming back over and over again for hours. That's not Pokemon to me. That's not fun. But then the other thing is this massive collectathon that is attached to one specific Pokemon you need to finish the game of 107 just randomly scattered around items with no real rhyme or reason to how they're hidden. That sucked. I hated that. Again, it just feels like very useless padding and not what I think of as like Pokemon fantasy.
That's AAA, is useless padding.
It doesn't have to be though. We can ask for better.
Yes.
A series that's really good about like the game starts after the credits roll is Monster Hunter, and that's also really grindy. But the problem is it didn't quite get into that same loop. Like you really need loot or just something to build upon as your character. Besides just, it felt like the research wasn't quite enough for it to feel less grindy, or at least for the grind to feel rewarding.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's parts of this game we like, there's parts we don't like. But do we see this as like a foundation for like is this like the future of Pokemon? Is this what we want it to be going forward?
God, I hope so. Oh my gosh. Yes, please. I would, this game I think would have been incredible if it had one more year to just fit, like take the thing that you already have and then fill out the world. And I think a lot about how I wish Game Freak, the Pokemon Company, Nintendo, this like triad partnership, whatever, would move to like the Call of Duty model of having 3 studios. So like have Game Freak, have either like a second Game Freak studio, or like break it apart, or like get another studio involved. And then like Ilka, who did Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl, and have each studio release a game. Like, so have Ilka do like a top-down remake like they did with Diamond and Pearl one year, and then the following year, I don't know, like have Bandai Namco do like a Snap or a Pokken Tournament or something, and then the third year have Game Freak do like a Pokemon Legends or a new gen of Pokemon or something, and just keep doing that so that everybody has more time. Because I feel like this pressure to release Pokemon games every single year is just resulting in, I think what you were saying earlier, these very unfinished experiences. But I think if they took the core of Legends Arceus and built on it and actually fleshed out like a Johto or a Kanto, that could be absolutely incredible.
Yeah, I think the ultimate Pokemon game would actually be a generational remake of Gold and Silver, but using the Legends, like mechanics. That would be the best thing. But I think they need to take a few more steps past the Legends model. They need to make it open world, or at least have the roots and whatever the wild areas are be kind of the same thing. So you just have these very big regions you can go around instead of just these tiny zones. And one of the reasons I'm convinced that they actually made this take place in basically sort of Hokkaido during when mainland Japan was starting to settle there, you have this big wild area and not a lot of stuff out there. So you have kind of just these like wild frontier that you can build those mechanics around. And by having, way more infrastructure and cities and stuff, they'll really need to have to balance pacing and mechanics for the more interactive elements of the game to really come through. And I hope they can do that. And I hope they're open to doing it for modern main series Pokemon stuff.
Yeah. I hope they don't completely ditch the old school top-down turn-based formula. I think I'm happy if it gets relegated to just remakes again, like Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. I don't think that is the future of the Pokemon franchise, but I do think it would be sad to sort of completely shed that old identity, because I still think the old like sprite-based games are still just my favorite thing that Pokemon has ever been.
Yeah, it's classic. There's a reason it's been around for 25 years and has changed very little for its core series.
Yeah, but there's some things you just can't really do anymore now that because there's no more 3DS. You can't do that kind of thing anymore and have it. I guess you can, because Diamond and Pearl sold very well, but there's some things that gamers just won't let you get away with it anymore, I think.
Yeah, who needs them? But yeah, just seeing them we're seeing them kind of like beta test in public between I feel like even Let's Go Pikachu was just an experiment of all right, how do we make a game on the Switch in HD, and then the wild areas is kind of this open world stuff, and then the DLC in Sword and Shield, it was all wild areas. We see them inching their, getting closer and closer every time. So it's I would hate for them to after making this big of a leap, I would hate for them to roll back. Even just as being one game. At this point, I find it to be such a grift how they sell 2 copies of these games or 4 copies sometimes. Mm-hmm. So even just as having one game, I'm that's great.
Yeah.
But yeah, apparently for Diamond and Pearl, the card actually has both games on it. There's just a 1 byte thing that says this is Diamond or this is Pearl, but otherwise all the data is on the media.
Yeah.
Wonderful. That's great.
Yeah. It kind of goes back to that, right? Now that there is there's still handheld systems, obviously. The Steam Deck is a real thing, but Nintendo is no longer doing a single dedicated handheld. And I think when that happened, when they made the move to just unify everything under the Switch, I think a lot of traditionally Game Boy DS developers got left out in the cold, right? And so we have some series that translated very well. I think Luigi's Mansion went from GameCube to DS and then back again. And I think it translated back again extremely well. And then we have all the farming sims are really struggling to figure out what they are now that they're not on handheld anymore. And then Pokemon, which is doing experiments and trying to figure out what it wants to be when it grows up and just isn't quite sure. But I think Legends Arceus is the closest thing we've seen to an actual meaningful answer.
Totally. It reminds me back when all the Japanese devs were struggling, just moving to HD at the beginning of the 360 kind of PS3 era.
Yeah.
So Pokemon Legends Arceus, parts of it are frustrating, parts of it are transcendent. So hopefully in the future we'll have some more that has more of those better parts. Both of you have reviews up. Rebekah, yours is on IGN. Yours is on PCMag. So check those out. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll talk to you next time.